September 1st, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. The tropical dawn broke over a landscape that had become the beating heart of Japan's Pacific War. Beneath the rising heat haze, lines of A6M-0 fighters stood glinting in perfect order, symbols of the Empire's mastery of the air. Inside the operations tent, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai scanned a new intelligence report that made him laugh aloud. The Americans, it said, had built another fighter, heavier than any before, wide as a bomber, sluggish and ugly. They called it the Hellcat. Sakai's laughter spread through the tent like relief. It was the kind of laughter that comes from certainty, not mockery. For 2 years, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had owned the Pacific skies. From the Philippines to the Indian Ocean, the Zero's kill ratios had seemed beyond arithmetic, 10-1, sometimes 20. The American design philosophy had always been predictable. Armor their planes like tanks, overload them with fuel, and trust machinery where the Japanese trusted skill. The reports claimed the Hellcat weighed 12,000 pounds, more than double a Zero. Sakai smirked. "Another American flying truck," he muttered. "Another death trap for its pilot." Yet outside the tent, the mathematics of supremacy were already shifting, quietly, invisibly, like a tide turning beneath the surface. The Hellcat, officially the Grumman F6F, was not built to outturn a Zero or to flatter its pilot's pride. It was built to erase the illusion that pride could survive industry. When the first prototypes flew in 1942, American test pilots called it the Brute. It looked inelegant, even primitive, but under its broad wings lay the most powerful piston engine ever fitted to a single-seat naval fighter, the 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. Its structure was double the Zero's weight, but it could dive at 650 km/h, climb 1,000 meters faster per minute, and return home after absorbing hits that would have turned the Japanese aircraft into ash. Sakai didn't know that yet. Neither did any of the men in Rabaul's humid ready rooms. They still believed in the Zero's perfection, in the myth of the warrior who could outfly machines. They believed range and maneuverability would forever trump power and protection. For them, weight was a sin. Armor was cowardice. But within 1 month, over Marcus Island, their laughter would fade in static-filled radios and burning contrails. The bloated Hellcat would begin a methodical extermination that defied every tactical truth they had built their empire upon. From September 1943 onward, the Pacific's balance of air power would invert with mathematical precision. The F6F would destroy 5,223 enemy aircraft, while losing only 270 in aerial combat, a ratio of 19-1. Behind every figure lay a pilot who discovered too late that belief could not outclimb horsepower, nor faith outturn steel. The era of the Zero was ending, and no one at Rabaul knew it. The ocean that had once belonged to Japan was about to be claimed by a machine that flew heavy, looked wrong, and killed with inevitability. The reckoning would begin 30 days later over a stretch of cloudless sea. To understand why the laughter in Rabaul felt justified, one must first understand the mythology of the A6M-0. For the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was not just a machine. It was a living extension of their will. Its creator, engineer Jiro Horikoshi, had designed it under a doctrine that rejected compromise. Every gram saved, every bolt lightened, every ounce of protection stripped away served one purpose: agility. The Zero's wings were carved from extra super duralumin, a classified aluminum alloy 30% lighter than anything the Americans could produce. It could climb to 6,000 meters in 7 minutes, fly 1,900 kilometers without refueling, and turn tighter than any known adversary. From 1941 through 1942, this design philosophy seemed vindicated. At Pearl Harbor, at Darwin, at the fall of the Dutch East Indies, Zeros dominated skies that had never seen such speed or grace. British Hurricanes and American P-40s disintegrated under their 20-millimeter cannons. Allied pilots spoke of encounters that ended before they could react. Silver flashes materializing from the sun, guns chattering, vanishing into blue silence. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would become Japan's ace of aces, wrote in his recovered diary, "Flying the Zero is like wearing wings. It obeys thought, not movement. It needs no force, only intention." To the men who read those words, this was not poetry. It was truth. The Zero was proof that spirit and skill could overcome mass and metal. But beneath the triumph, cracks had already begun to form, hidden by the brilliance of early victories. The same design purity that gave the Zero its unmatched agility also made it fatally fragile. No armor shielded the pilot's seat. No self-sealing tanks prevented fuel from turning to fire. The fuselage's thin aluminum skin, so light and responsive, could be torn open by a single .50 caliber round. A hit anywhere in the fuel system meant instant combustion. By 1943, the Americans had learned this through bitter experience and adapted. The U.S. Navy understood it wasn't pilot skill alone that would win the Pacific. It was reproducible performance, mechanical endurance, and industrial volume. The Hellcat was designed around that principle. Its armor plate weighed as much as an entire Zero's cockpit section. Its self-sealing tanks could absorb multiple hits without flame, and its radial engine, air-cooled and redundant, could take shrapnel through the cylinders and still deliver power. Japanese engineers saw this as inelegant. They called it barbaric, proof that the Americans were slaves to machinery. The contradiction was philosophical. The Japanese saw war as a contest of spirit. The Americans saw it as a problem of production and statistics. The Zero, with its feather-light frame and 130 horsepower Nakajima Sakai engine, embodied faith. The Hellcat, with its 2,000 horsepower double wasp and armor glass thick as a ship's bridge, embodied calculation. The illusion of supremacy persisted because it had once been real. The early war Zero had faced enemies unprepared for its range or tactics. Allied pilots were trained in defensive flying, not the high-G turn battles that the Zero thrived on. Japan's veterans had hundreds of hours of combat. Their foes were still learning in blood. In that first year, the mathematics favored faith. But by mid-1943, the equations began to shift. American fighters were faster, stronger, and flown by pilots who now understood energy fighting, the science of altitude, velocity, and momentum. The Zero's gift of turning inside an opponent no longer mattered if that opponent never entered a turn. In the new kind of air war, endurance replaced elegance. In the engine rooms of Grumman Aircraft's Long Island plant, men and women who had never seen combat built machines that would soon rewrite those equations. They riveted, bolted, and welded by the thousands, producing Hellcats at a rate of one every hour, each one heavier than belief, each one a contradiction to everything Japanese doctrine held sacred. Yet on airfields from Rabaul to Truk, none of this was visible. There, the air still smelled of confidence, of oil, sea salt, and inevitability. Pilots still knelt before the rising sun flag before takeoff, still recited oaths of devotion, still believed that the Empire's sky was eternal. The first Hellcats were already crossing that sky. In 30 days, faith would meet arithmetic, and the arithmetic would not blink. September 30th, 1943, Marcus Island. The first recorded engagement between Japan's trusted guardians of the Pacific and the strange, heavy American machine unfolded under a flawless blue morning. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was flying escort for a reconnaissance mission. Routine work, a flight pattern repeated so often, it had become muscle memory. When his observer pointed southeast and shouted over the engine noise, Fukui saw them. 6 dark blue shapes climbing through thin cloud. At first he dismissed them as bombers, B-25s perhaps. But as the sun struck their wings, their form became unmistakable. Single engines, massive fuselages, wingtips that seemed too short for their bulk. Not bombers, not any type listed in the manuals. He recorded in his after-action report. First encounter with F6F type fighter. Appearance, heavy, broad, unrefined, assumed to be fighter guns mounted on a torpedo aircraft. Fukui rolled into a steep diving turn, initiating the maneuver that had defined Japanese aerial supremacy since Pearl Harbor. The tactic was simple and absolute. Draw the opponent into a turning fight, exploit the Zero's razor-thin wing loading and superior climb rate, slide onto his tail, and deliver cannon fire at close range. He expected the American to panic, to turn desperately or dive away. Instead, the Hellcat pulled straight up, vertically. The maneuver broke every known rule of dogfighting physics. The F6F's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine hurled it skyward with 700 more horsepower than the Zero's Nakajima Sakai could muster. Fukui's airspeed decayed almost instantly as his aircraft clawed at the thin air. By 15,000 feet, he was near stall. The Hellcat, impossibly, executed a hammerhead turn, a full vertical pivot, then dropped nose first toward him. He wrote later, "Enemy opened fire at 400 meters. 6 guns, not 4. The volume of fire was unbelievable. In 3 seconds, his Zero absorbed 17 hits. Control cables shredded. The fuel gauge spun to 0. Only by forcing the aircraft into a spin did he extinguish the flames long enough to limp home. His wingman never returned, nor did the reconnaissance plane. That morning, the first blood went to the Hellcat. 5 days later, the lesson was repeated, on a larger scale over Wake Island. Task Force 14, carriers Yorktown, Cowpens, and Independence launched strikes against Japanese installations. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga of the 252nd Air Group led 12 Zeros to intercept. The advantage was theirs: altitude, surprise, and numbers. We saw them below, 12 blue fighters in 3 groups, Shiga recorded in his diary. We dived from 20,000 feet. They did not scatter. They climbed toward us. I thought them mad. As the Zeros dove, the Hellcats held formation, maintaining energy rather than bleeding it away in turns. Tracers from the Japanese guns sparked against their armored bellies. When the American pilots counterattacked, they didn't try to turn. They climbed, rolled, and dove in slashing passes, converting altitude into speed. Shiga's words captured the transformation taking place in real time. They did not fight as men do. They fought as machines. Their weight gave them speed. They struck like hawks, vanished upward, returned again from above. No escape possible. 8 Zeros were destroyed in minutes. None of the Hellcats failed to return to their carriers. In Tokyo, the reports sounded absurd. The Navy Technical Bureau dismissed them as exaggerations or poor piloting. A heavier fighter could not outfight a lighter one. Mathematics, they insisted, did not lie. But the equations were changing. The Hellcat's armor told part of the story. 212 pounds of hardened plate protecting the pilot, 110 pounds shielding the oil system, and self-sealing fuel tanks that absorbed dozens of hits without ignition. Its 650 caliber M2 Brownings delivered 4,500 rounds per minute, 3 times the kinetic energy of the Zero's twin, 7.77 millimeter guns and 20 millimeter cannons combined. Its radial engine produced more than thrust. It produced psychological shock. The roar of 18 cylinders at combat power could be heard long before the aircraft appeared. A mechanical storm that announced a new kind of enemy. To Fukui, to Shega, and to every pilot who survived those first encounters, the realization was the same. The ocean sky, once governed by finesse and precision, now belonged to mass, armor, and speed. After Wake Island, intercepts grew more desperate. Japanese squadrons began climbing higher, searching for ambushes from altitude. But the Hellcats adapted again, using zoom and boom tactics perfected by U.S. instructors who studied German Luftwaffe reports from Europe. What the Germans had learned fighting the P-47 Thunderbolt, the Americans now applied in the Pacific. The Zero, born to turn, was trapped in a world that now fought in the vertical. By mid-October, pilots at Truk and Rabaul whispered the new word with unease: Hellcat. It no longer sounded clumsy, it sounded final. And as autumn 1943 deepened, Japan's greatest pilots began to discover a truth colder than defeat, one that statistics would soon confirm beyond redemption. The sky no longer belonged to them. The Empire's next encounter with the Hellcat would prove it was not just an aircraft. It was a doctrine made flesh. October 5th, 1943. Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shega's flight returned with 8 aircraft missing. The mechanics counted the bullet holes in the survivors and stared in disbelief. The Zero's skin was so thin that the holes looked like knife punctures, scattered across wings and fuselage in hundreds. None of the Hellcats they had faced had fallen. None even smoked. For 2 years, Japanese pilots had mocked the idea of armor. Weight is the enemy of flight, their instructors taught. Every pound of protection stole altitude. Every ounce of fuel meant lost maneuverability. The Zero's engineers had followed that logic to its limit. The aircraft's loaded weight was barely 2,130 kilograms, light enough to take off from the shortest carrier deck, agile enough to pivot in a 180-degree turn within a radius of 187 meters. The Hellcat weighed more than twice that, 5,530 kilograms. By every principle of aerodynamics the Japanese had learned, it should have been clumsy, unresponsive, a metal boulder forced into the air by brute power. Instead, it flew like a contradiction, heavy yet balanced, armored yet precise, slow to turn but impossible to shake. American pilots called it forgiving. It could absorb damage that killed lesser machines. A single Hellcat could return to its carrier with a wing riddled, a fuel tank perforated, or cylinders shot away, and still land safely. The phrase used by mechanics aboard USS Yorktown became legendary. Bring it back in a basket, we'll build it again tomorrow. That resilience reshaped combat itself. On October 5th, Task Force 14's carriers launched their raid on Wake Island, partly to test the new aircraft in large-scale action. 12 Hellcats from VF-5 flew cover for dive bombers. The Japanese defenders, 12 Zeros under Shega's command, had the advantage of altitude and surprise. The result should have been textbook, but the battle's physics betrayed its textbooks. As the Zeros dived, the Hellcats didn't scatter. They tightened formation. Their leaders maintained a shallow descent, preserving energy. Tracers sparked harmlessly across their fuselages. When the Americans climbed again, their altitude advantage multiplied their speed, transforming weight into a weapon. At 7,600 meters, where the Zero's single-stage supercharger struggled for oxygen, the F6F still produced over 1,600 horsepower. In seconds, the balance inverted. The Japanese fighters that had begun as hunters became targets. Lieutenant Shega's own diary captured the disbelief. We fired first, yet they climbed away untouched. Their armor shrugged off hits that would shatter a Zero. When they returned, they came down like falling iron. Their guns did not fire. They roared. I saw my comrades vanish in clouds of sparks. Their weight gave them strength. Our lightness betrayed us. That was the paradox. For years, Japan's designers had pursued perfection through subtraction. Less metal, less fuel, less protection. The Hellcat's engineers had built dominance through addition. More horsepower, more armor, more ammunition. It violated every elegant principle of aeronautical efficiency, yet it worked. When the Zeros attempted to engage in horizontal turns, they lost speed. When they climbed, they lost power. When they dived, they lost control. Against an enemy that could choose altitude at will, all of their vaunted agility became meaningless. After the battle, U.S. Navy analysts examined gun camera footage. The average Hellcat firing burst lasted just 2.8 seconds, barely enough time to align crosshairs. Yet in that instant, 6 Browning M2s delivered 138 projectiles, each with nearly 3,500 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. A single burst could cut through an aircraft frame from propeller spinner to tail. In the weeks that followed, the American pilots learned to trust the mathematics of energy fighting. The Japanese learned they could no longer afford to. Over Truk and the Marshalls, entire Japanese formations disintegrated under Hellcat assaults that looked less like duels and more like equations resolving themselves. A dive from 8,000 meters translated into a 160 km/h speed advantage. Momentum carried the F6F through firing range and back into the clouds before a Zero could respond. To the pilots of the Imperial Navy, this was more than tactical defeat. It was philosophical collapse. The air, once an arena of individual mastery, had become a battlefield governed by physics and horsepower. Lieutenant Shiga's final entry before his death read simply, "They do not fear damage. They trust their machines." By November, the Japanese High Command began to grasp the magnitude of the change. The Americans were no longer improvising. Their pilots fought like engineers. Their aircraft flew like factories on wings. Zero's era had been built on faith in human skill. The Hellcat's power proved that faith had weight, and that weight, properly used, could kill faster than belief. The next blow would come not from the air itself, but from doctrine, how each side chose to fight. And in that realm, too, Japan would discover that the rules had changed. November 11th, 1943. Rabaul. Inside the briefing hut of the 204th Air Group, 30 pilots gathered in silence as Lieutenant Commander Tanemizu Takao drew a diagram on the chalkboard. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and resignation. Many of the men had flown in the South Pacific since 1942. Half of them bore bandages or burns. None had slept well since their last mission. Tanemizu turned to face them. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he said. "The Americans have changed the rules." He had survived multiple encounters with the new F6F Hellcat, and was one of the few who could explain what had gone wrong. Until then, Japanese aerial doctrine had rested on one immutable principle: individual brilliance. Pilots were trained to fight as samurai of the air, solo duelists who relied on intuition, agility, and personal skill. Communication between aircraft was minimal. Radios, when carried at all, were often removed to save weight. The Americans, Tanemizu explained, fought differently. They fly like machines. One covers another. They never fight alone. The Hellcat's radio system was its unseen weapon. The SCR-522 VHF set, crystal-controlled and static-free, allowed entire formations to coordinate with precision across dozens of kilometers. While Japanese pilots shouted through weak, distorted transmitters, Hellcat squadrons moved as synchronized organisms, attacking and disengaging with timing that appeared preordained. U.S. Navy doctrine had evolved beyond chivalry. It was now science. Instead of one pilot seeking glory, pairs of fighters, lead and wingman, operated as a unit, alternating attack and defense. Two pairs formed a division. Two divisions formed a section. Dozens of sections could be vectored into combat through real-time radio commands from radar controllers aboard carriers hundreds of kilometers away. To the Japanese, it felt supernatural. Hellcats arrived from unseen altitudes, perfectly aligned with the sun, always knowing where to strike. Radar-directed interception turned the Pacific sky into a chessboard only the Americans could see. Lieutenant Sadamu Kumachi, who survived one of these engagements over Truk Lagoon, described the sensation. They came out of clouds exactly on our course. No warning, no visual contact. Their attack was precise, like an execution. We were blind men fighting opponents who saw in the dark. In contrast, Japanese operations still depended on visual spotting and guesswork. Ground controllers with outdated equipment relayed bearing estimates by voice telephone. By the time warnings reached the airfields, American aircraft were already overhead. The shift from instinct to information warfare was catastrophic. By late 1943, Japanese air strength in the Solomons had collapsed to barely 300 serviceable aircraft. Replacement pilots were rushed from training units after barely 200 hours of flight time, one-third the experience of early war veterans. U.S. pilots, by comparison, arrived in theater with over 300 hours and the benefit of rigorous gunnery and formation practice. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had once led the attack on Pearl Harbor, inspected damaged Zeros returning from combat. What he found appalled him. Aircraft riddled with holes, wings scorched, engines starved of fuel, radios missing or broken. His report to Combined Fleet Headquarters was blunt. We are fighting professionals with amateurs. Hellcat pilots, guided by radar, intelligence, and superior coordination, no longer saw their opponents as equals, but as components in a predictable system. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu of VF6 described it clinically. Once you learn the Zero's limitations, its climb above 20,000 feet, its dive speed, you just stay outside that envelope. They fly into your guns. The old warrior creed that had sustained Japan's aviators now became a death sentence. Fighting alone was noble, but suicidal. Teamwork, once dismissed as mechanical, was now the essence of survival. In Rabaul's darkening skies, the shift was visible. The once disciplined formations of Silver Zeros grew erratic, scattering into chaotic spirals as their radios failed or their leaders fell. The Hellcats pressed in pairs, firing short, measured bursts, climbing out, reforming, striking again. Tanamizu's closing words that day carried the weight of inevitability. The enemy no longer fights for honor. He fights for efficiency. He wins because his machines, his pilots, and his commanders act as one. We fight as men. They fight as a system. In the coming months, that system would expand beyond tactics. It would reach into factories, training schools, and radar rooms, an entire civilization reorganized around the science of war. And for Japan's proud airmen, it meant that valor alone would never again decide the sky. December 1943. Truk Lagoon. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, once the celebrated architect of the Pearl Harbor strike, now stood on the coral tarmac of Japan's most critical base, staring at wrecks that told a different story. The returning Zeros no longer looked like weapons of empire. They looked like survivors. Bullet holes patched with tin, engines coughing blue smoke, radio wires dangling like torn veins. Each crippled aircraft carried the same message. Technology had turned against its creators. By late 1943, Japan's aviation industry was fighting a war it could no longer sustain. Aluminum shortages forced engineers to use inferior alloys. Skilled machinists were drafted into infantry divisions, leaving factories manned by students and elderly men. Production was still heroic, roughly 100 aircraft a month, but half never reached combat units due to mechanical failures. The Americans, by contrast, were producing miracles at scale. In the same months, Grumman's factory on Long Island turned out more than 400 F6F Hellcats per month. Each part was interchangeable, each aircraft identical to the next, a product of precision tooling that Japanese engineers could not replicate under bombardment. Even the Zero's most sacred asset, its engine, was betraying it. The Nakajima Sakai, once an engineering masterpiece, had reached its limit. Starved of high-octane fuel and refined lubricants, it lost reliability and power. The F6F's Pratt & Whitney R2800, by comparison, could produce 2,000 horsepower for hours on end and shrug off damage that would kill any liquid-cooled engine. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, training officer at Kasumigara Naval Air Station, wrote his final report in January 1944. "We are sending children to fight professionals." Yesterday, Ensign Yamamoto arrived at the front. He had never fired his guns in flight. "We have no ammunition for practice." He had never flown at night. "We have no fuel for such training." He lasted 7 minutes in his first combat. In 1941, Japan's elite naval aviators had averaged 700 flight hours before deployment. By 1944, the figure was less than 100. Fuel shortages forced instructors to rely on gliders or brief classroom lectures. Gunnery practice was reduced to 50 rounds per pilot, less than an American trainee fired in a single afternoon. Across the ocean, at training bases in Florida, California, and Texas, American pilots were logging over 300 hours in the cockpit before entering combat. They flew live fire ranges daily. They practiced carrier landings until muscle memory replaced fear. They studied energy fighting using mock duels that replicated Zero tactics exactly. The Gulf in preparation was measured not in skill, but in survivability. Every Hellcat pilot arriving aboard a carrier had been hardened by repetition. Every Japanese replacement pilot was learning under fire with no second chances. Technology deepened the divide. American radar coverage extended like an invisible wall across the Pacific. From land stations in the Solomons to shipboard controllers aboard fleet carriers, radar operators could track Japanese aircraft 80 kilometers away, vectoring fighters directly onto their prey. Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi, recalling a late 1943 engagement over Truk, described the effect. "We never saw them until they were above us. It was like being hunted by ghosts. Our first warning was gunfire." Japan's own radar sets, primitive and few in number, were unreliable and easily jammed. Communication between ground stations and pilots broke down constantly. The result was chaos, scrambles that launched too late, patrols that intercepted nothing, and ambushes that became massacres. Worse still, the materials war was unwinnable. American aircraft were fueled by refined 100-octane gasoline shipped from refineries in Texas and California, fuel that allowed full engine performance at altitude. Japan's domestic refineries could produce only 87-octane fuel, sometimes diluted further with pine root oil or alcohol. The results were disastrous: misfiring engines, detonation, and in-flight explosions. By 1944, reports from frontline maintenance crews spoke of engines seizing mid-combat and landing gear collapsing from brittle steel. The legendary Zero had become a fragile relic of early war optimism. And through every engagement, the Hellcats' numbers grew. Each month, new carrier groups arrived, pilots trained by men who had survived the previous campaign, armed with better radios, computing gun sights, and engines whose components were measured in thousandths of an inch. The war that Japan had imagined, a duel of heroes, had transformed into an industrial extermination. Every failed engine, every untrained pilot, every missing bolt carried the same verdict. Japan was no longer fighting an enemy nation. It was fighting a machine that produced machines, and the machine was accelerating. By spring 1944, the consequences of that acceleration would be measured not in aircraft lost, but in air fleets erased, entire generations of pilots annihilated in single days. The next great test of air power would come in the Marianas. There, over a sea glinting like glass, the myth of Japanese air mastery would finally shatter into arithmetic. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. To Japanese observers aboard Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier Taiho, the horizon shimmered with sunlight and certainty. More than 430 Japanese aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, rose from carrier decks in perfect order. They were the remnants of a doctrine built on faith and courage. Ahead lay the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the largest naval force ever assembled in the Pacific. For Tokyo's planners, the A-Go operation was not just a counterattack, it was redemption. At 10:15 a.m., radar operators aboard the carrier Essex detected the approaching waves, first at 210 km, then closing at 180, then 150. Controllers calmly vectored squadrons of Hellcats to intercept. The radio network lit with clipped efficiency. Bogies! Angels 25, heading 180. VF-16, you're cleared hot. Within minutes, 450 F6F Hellcats filled the sky, climbing to intercept before the Japanese even reached visual range. From the ground, the formations looked like swarms of blue steel moving with mathematical precision. The battle that followed would later earn a name that mocked everything the Zero once stood for. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, many barely trained, entered the engagement believing they would encounter an equal fight. Instead, they faced radar-directed ambushes from aircraft that could dive faster, climb higher, and withstand hits their own machines could not. The first wave of 69 attackers broke apart before reaching the fleet. Hellcats from VF-15 and VF-2 dove from above at 650 km/h, shredding formations before they could deploy. It was like shooting fallen leaves, one American pilot wrote. Lieutenant David McCampbell, commanding VF-15 aboard Essex, recorded 9 confirmed kills in one mission, 7 within 15 minutes. His gunnery film showed Zeros bursting into flame from half a kilometer away, victims of a gun sight that automatically corrected for range and lead. The Japanese pilots never saw the mathematics behind their destruction. The Americans did. Each Hellcat's AN/APS-4 radar, rangefinder, and computing sight turned air combat into geometry. Range, closure rate, and trajectory merged into a simple dot in the pilot's glass. Pull the trigger. The problem solved itself. By sunset, Japanese radio networks dissolved into chaos. Messages overlapped, coordinates contradicted, and static swallowed orders. Carrier decks that had launched their squadrons hours before waited in vain. Many aircraft, unable to locate their own ships, ditched into the sea when fuel ran dry. Out of 430 aircraft launched by Ozawa's mobile fleet, fewer than 100 returned. The U.S. lost 29. The loss was more than tactical. It was existential. The Zero, once the embodiment of Japanese genius, was now a statistical footnote in an industrial war. Admiral Ozawa, watching the horizon from Taiho, understood the magnitude of what he was witnessing. He later wrote, "Our planes were strong once, our pilots unmatched. But war had become a factory. They could lose 100 and not notice. We lost one and felt it in our bones. The industrial contrast was total. By June 1944, American factories had produced over 8,500 F6F Hellcats. Japan's total zero output for the same year was barely 3,000, most lacking proper radios, many assembled from scavenged parts. When the surviving Japanese fleet regrouped 4 months later for the Battle of Leyte Gulf, their carrier decks were nearly empty. Many carriers served only as decoys, floating bait for American bombers. The Hellcats met the last vestiges of Japan's naval air arm with ruthless consistency. October 24, 1944. The air over the Sibuyan Sea shimmered with contrails and falling flame. The few veteran Japanese pilots left in Ozawa's command led green recruits who could barely navigate. Those who survived takeoff met radar-guided interceptions before ever sighting a target. Hellcat pilot Lieutenant Halford Wilson recalled, "It wasn't combat anymore, it was erasure." In 48 hours, American carrier groups destroyed 600 Japanese aircraft. At Leyte, as U.S. forces landed on Philippine beaches, the Imperial Navy's final air strength collapsed. Admiral Ozawa's after-action report was a requiem. The enemy's strength lies not in numbers alone, but in his unity of system. Every radar pulse, every plane, every pilot, every bomb is part of one machine. We are not fighting men. We are fighting industry itself. Back in Tokyo, this truth arrived too late. Factories that once built Zeros by the hundreds now lay silent under American bombing. Fuel stores were nearly exhausted. Aluminum was rationed by the gram, and in classrooms across Japan, instructors handed teenagers flight manuals printed on rice paper. They would soon climb into aircraft, barely fit to fly, fueled by hope and desperation, sent against machines designed to survive the impossible. The age of mastery had ended. What followed would be an age of sacrifice. The next year, as Hellcats swept over Okinawa, Japan's final weapon would emerge, not born of engineering, but of despair. And for the pilots who launched into that last inferno, even death would not be enough to reclaim the sky. April 6, 1945, the sky over Okinawa. From the decks of Task Force 58's carriers, the view resembled a horizon on fire. Hundreds of dots appeared on radar screens, enemy aircraft inbound from Kyushu, Shikoku, and Formosa. They came not in squadrons, but in waves. Kamikazes, Japan's final weapon. The Hellcats rose to meet them. For 18 months, the F6F had evolved from a heavy new design into the backbone of American naval air power. The latest variant, the F6F5, now carried a 2-stage supercharger, improved armor, and a reinforced canopy. Its skin was painted deep-sea blue, its engine rated at 2,200 horsepower, and its 6 Browning 50-caliber guns remained unchanged because nothing better was needed. What had changed was the enemy. No longer did the Americans face trained aviators. They faced boys, some barely 17, piloting obsolete aircraft packed with explosives. Their attacks were not tactical. They were mathematical, the last desperate variable in a war already decided. From the command ship Bunker Hill, radar operators guided Hellcats into interception arcs long before the kamikazes reached the fleet. "Bandits, Angels 10, bearing 150. The pilots acknowledged with calm precision. They had done this hundreds of times. One of them, Lieutenant Clarence Tommy Tomes, recorded in his flight log, "They come straight at you, no evasive action. You fire, and they keep coming until there's nothing left to burn." On April 12th, the U.S. Navy launched 1,500 sorties in a single day. The Hellcats flew in what carrier doctrine called the mowing machine pattern, alternating lines of interceptors sweeping the sky like clockwork blades. The efficiency was chilling. Each wave replaced the last before fuel or ammunition ran low. Japanese attackers rarely reached within sight of the American fleet. During the Okinawa campaign, the Hellcat achieved kill ratios approaching 25 to 1. Out of nearly 1,900 Japanese aircraft destroyed, the majority fell to F6F pilots. The enemy's losses could no longer even be calculated accurately. Most vanished into the sea, consumed by impact and fire. Captain Rufus Pete Valencia of VF9 described it in a post-war interview. There was no sense of victory. You shot them because they were coming for your ships. You saw the faces sometimes right before the fire. It didn't feel like combat anymore. It felt like a factory line. Below, the American fleet absorbed the few attacks that broke through. Ships burned, sailors died, but the outcome never changed. Every wave of kamikazes was replaced by emptier skies. Japan's pilot schools were gone, its fuel nearly exhausted, its aircraft built from wood and desperation. The Hellcat had become the mechanical embodiment of inevitability. Yet even amid dominance, its design continued to evolve. Grumman engineers reinforced wings to carry 1,000-pound bombs, turning the F6F into a fighter bomber that could strike ground targets and still defend its fleet. The aircraft's versatility made it the U.S. Navy's answer to every mission: escort, interception, strafing, close support. From carriers operating off Okinawa, Hellcats destroyed hangars, airfields, and convoys with the same dispassionate precision that had defined their air combat. They strafed aircraft still being assembled, shredded convoys fleeing mainland ports, and left Japan's logistics in ruins. The numbers told a story that words could not soften. By July 1945, more than 12,200 Hellcats had been built. They had destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft for the loss of only 270 in air combat. No fighter in history had achieved such imbalance. But in the cockpits, there was no celebration. Lieutenant Howard Thayer, VF-31, wrote in his diary, "We don't fight men anymore. We fight machines flown by ghosts." The Zero that terrified us 2 years ago is a memory. The pilots we meet now are boys dying for nothing. The sea takes them before we even see their faces. From the decks of U.S. carriers, the ocean stretched silent and endless. Across it, the remnants of Japan's air power dissolved like smoke. The Imperial Navy's last carriers had no aircraft. The Zero's factories lay in ruins, its designer, Jiro Horikoshi, living in evacuation, writing in a notebook that his nation's engineering had reached the limits of flesh and faith. As the Americans closed on the Japanese mainland, the Hellcat's role began to fade, not from obsolescence, but from victory. The war it had been built to fight no longer existed. Its enemies were gone, its purpose fulfilled. On August 15, 1945, when Japan finally accepted surrender, hundreds of Hellcats sat idle on the decks of carriers anchored near Okinawa, engines silent. Their pilots, who had once measured their lives in missions, now stared at the horizon and wondered if the world would ever need them again. The aircraft that had been dismissed as a flying truck had swept the sky clean. The empire that had laughed at it no longer had a sky to defend. But the reckoning would not end with surrender. It would continue on the ground, in silence, as the men who once fought each other met face to face and realized the true cost of the war of machines. August 30th, 1945. Atsugi Airfield, Kanagawa Prefecture. The sky was clear, almost unnaturally so, as the first U.S. Navy F6F Hellcats descended in formation over Tokyo Bay. Below them lay a nation silent in defeat, airfields stripped bare, factories reduced to rubble, and cities smoldering under the weight of surrender. The same runways where Japanese pilots had once saluted the rising sun now bore the chalk markings of occupation forces. For the men of the Imperial Navy who remained, it was not just the end of a war. It was the end of an idea. They gathered at the edge of the airfield, still in their faded flight uniforms, watching the Hellcats land one after another. The roar of the Pratt and Whitney engines was familiar now. No longer terrifying, just inevitable. Lieutenant Commander Tanimizu Takao, who had once briefed his pilots to forget everything they knew, stood expressionless as the first Hellcat taxied past. Its blue wings gleamed in the same sunlight that had once blessed the Zero. On its fuselage, painted in white, was a small emblem, USS Yorktown, USS. The symbolism was brutal. The hunter had become the guest. Nearby, a group of American mechanics stepped from their transports, their movements calm and methodical. They inspected the airfield, chalked boundaries for maintenance zones, and went to work. One of them, unaware of who was watching, ran his hand gently across the fuselage of a captured Zero, marveling at its lightness. Saburo Sakai, now blind in one eye and a survivor of every phase of the war, stood a few meters away. He later recalled the moment in his memoirs. They came not as monsters, but as men. Their aircraft were ugly, heavy, and invincible. Our aircraft were beautiful, light, and gone. I understood then that beauty had no meaning in war. The irony was complete. The Zero's creator, Jiro Horikoshi, would later write that the aircraft's perfection had been its curse. We believed that the spirit of flight was found in lightness, he admitted in 1946. The Americans believed it was found in endurance. They were right. Historians would frame the contest between the Zero and the Hellcat as a duel between two civilizations. One measured strength by precision of craft, the other by power of system. The Zero represented an empire that worshipped sacrifice. The Hellcat represented a nation that worshipped efficiency. By the end of the war, Japan's production had yielded 10,939 Zeros. The United States had built 12,275 Hellcats, each one stronger, faster, and easier to replace. But numbers alone did not tell the story. It was the philosophy behind them that decided the outcome. In the silence after surrender, Japanese engineers inspected the wreckage of both machines. They measured armor thickness, fuel tank design, control linkage tolerances. They found nothing mystical in the American aircraft, only method, precision, and abundance. Admiral Ozawa, testifying before the occupation authorities, summarized Japan's defeat with brutal clarity. Our pilots fought as warriors. Theirs fought as engineers. We lost not to courage, but to calculation. Across Japan, surviving aviators returned to civilian life. Some became mechanics, some teachers, others never flew again. But in their memories, one truth endured, that the skies they once ruled had been reclaimed not by fate, but by physics. The Hellcat had ended more than an air war. It had ended an age of illusion. In the years that followed, both nations rebuilt. American factories shifted from warplanes to automobiles. Japan's engineers, humbled but unbroken, began designing new machines, heavier, stronger, disciplined by mathematics rather than myth. On display at the Yokosuka Aviation Museum today, a single F6F Hellcat stands beside a preserved Zero. The plaque between them bears no slogans, only a line of text engraved in quiet precision. One was built on faith, the other on fact. Only one survived the fire. And beneath that truth lies the question history never stops asking. When machines inherit the sky, what part of humanity do they leave behind?